As we all know, finding a true gem at a salvage auction is incredibly rare, but today, Jim struck gold. He won this Corvette C6 at auction for just $11,000. What he didn't realize was that under the hood was an engine worth over $30,000. He took a huge risk bidding on it. The car's damage was listed as an engine fire, and the auction photos showed that some parts had also been stolen. But Jim bought it anyway because the engine was still there, and the rest of the car's body was in excellent condition with only minor damage to the door. For Jim, that would be an easy fix. The interior, aside from being a bit dirty, was fine, though the steering wheel airbag had deployed. He put the car on a lift and confirmed the chassis had no rust or damage. Although it was an engine fire, it didn't look too severe. And the biggest surprise came from the engine. Jim discovered it wasn't the stock 6.2-liter aluminum LS3. It was a more powerful, custom-built LSX engine. This meant the car had been professionally modified. To find out the engine's true condition, he'd have to tear it down. So the team quickly began the disassembly. But while draining the oil, Jim noticed some fine metal shavings on the drain plug. This made him worry, but what's done is done. All he could do was continue the teardown. As they progressed, Jim realized the car was in better shape than he had anticipated. He didn't find any major components missing, so he was still unsure what had been stolen. Soon, the entire drivetrain was separated from the body. Next was the engine. They had to disconnect everything attached to it, including the radiator and coolers. The wiring in the engine bay was a complete mess for some reason, but before long, the massive engine was lifted out. They separated it from the subframe and removed the exhaust manifolds. The engine surface showed clear signs of being burned, especially the plastic sheathing on the wiring, which had mostly melted. The clutch, however, was undamaged, with only some surface rust. Whether they'd replace it would depend on their plan. After removing the clutch, he could see the LSX stamp on the block, confirming his earlier suspicion. The fire had melted some seals and gaskets, causing several leaks, but to know the internal condition, he had to open it up. While the fuel injectors on this engine were high-end, they couldn't survive a fire, so they'd have to be replaced. Jim removed all the accessory components from the engine, many of which were still usable. Unfortunately, the intake manifold was a total loss, as it had been severely damaged by the fire. But the good news was that when he opened the valve covers, the internals looked brand new, with only a small amount of milky white residue. Other than that, everything was perfect. He flipped the engine over and removed the oil pan. He found no metal shavings or debris inside. After removing the windage tray, he could see the massive crankshaft, which also looked brand new. He could even see the gold-colored pistons, which had small text engraved on them. The crankshaft also had some part numbers stamped on it. Using a borescope, he saw that the cylinder walls only had a small amount of carbon buildup. The connecting rods also had text engraved on them. Jim had a friend look up the part numbers and discovered they were not cheap. He also found out more about this engine's history. No one could have guessed that this 7.0-liter LSX engine was built by the legendary Steve Morris. Its value exceeded $30,000. This was an incredible stroke of luck, the kind Jim had never experienced before.
Given this discovery, Jim decided to unleash the engine's full potential. The first step, a twin-turbo setup. But before that, some components needed to be changed, like the oil pan and valve covers. The crank pulley was also swapped for a new one. The engine bay needed a major cleanup. The burned wiring and warped hoses would all be replaced, so he just ripped them out. The brake booster had lost all its pressure, and even parts of the firewall were damaged, but this was an easy fix for Jim. He mixed some fiberglass resin with black pigment, wiped the area clean, and applied it. Once it hardened, a little sanding was all it needed. With the repair done, it was time for a deep clean of the engine bay. For the transmission and driveshaft, Jim sourced a set from a Corvette Z06. It was the strongest drivetrain he could find that would fit. This also meant the original rubber mounts were replaced with solid metal ones. The subframe had some oil stains and oxidation, so he gave it a thorough cleaning before assembling the new transmission onto it. The engine mounts were also upgraded to more robust units. After assembling the engine onto the front subframe, he could drop it back into the car. Jim then found a set of exhaust manifolds from a 5th-gen Camaro, which fit perfectly and were much cheaper than a custom set. Unfortunately, one side interfered with the brake booster, so that manifold had to be modified. Now came the most difficult part, positioning the two turbos. The C6 engine bay is notoriously cramped, and every inch of space had to be utilized. The piping had to be designed to be as compact as possible, while also considering the placement of other components, like the wastegate for each turbo. The entire turbo kit was provided by B&R, a company that primarily builds kits for race cars. It's safe to say Jim was sparing no expense. Now he just had to figure out how to mount them. He fabricated his own brackets to secure the turbos. With the turbos in place, it was time for the new intake manifold. It was significantly larger than the original because it had a built-in intercooler. It uses water to cool the air entering the engine, increasing its density, which means more power. This thing was so massive that the only way to get it to fit was to cut into the firewall. He installed a new seal and mounted it on the engine. The engine bay now looked absolutely menacing. The throttle body was the original one, just slightly modified. Every dollar saved counts. Next, he had to fit the blow-off valve. The most tedious part of working in this tight space was routing all the plumbing. The team had to get creative. Underneath the car, the C6 uses a dual-tank fuel system with a crossover tube. Since Jim was building a high-horsepower Corvette, the stock fuel pump couldn't supply enough fuel, so he had to drop the tanks, remove the original pump, and replace it with a massive external fuel pump setup. These two brushless pumps, running in series, could supply enough fuel for up to 4,000 horsepower. To demonstrate, they did a quick test outside. It was basically a water pump. Definitely don't try this at home if you're not a professional. The old fuel injectors were toast, so he installed a brand new set. As each necessary component was installed, the already tight engine bay became even more crowded. Next, he had to fit the radiator. Before that, Jim had a new heat exchanger and a coolant reservoir ready. There was no space left in the engine bay for the metal reservoir tank, so he turned his attention to the trunk. Inside, apart from the thick carpet, there was just some wiring for an old sound system, which Jim had no plans to use. He ripped it all out. He added ice to the reservoir, secured it in the trunk, and ran one line to the intercooler on the intake manifold and the other to the front-mounted heat exchanger, creating a complete cooling loop. For the science behind this setup, I'll have to ask the experts in the comments to explain.
They test-fitted the front bumper, and luckily, it still fit. As for the main radiator, the stock one Jim had prepared technically fit, but considering all the wiring, hoses, and brackets still to come, he had to switch to two smaller, thicker radiators. Their total volume was about the same, but their smaller size allowed for more flexible mounting options. Of course, all the brackets had to be custom fabricated. He then installed a new water pump and connected the hoses. With all the pipes crisscrossing, he had to wrap some of them in heat shielding where they touched to prevent them from affecting each other. Jim added some fuel to the tank and confirmed the fuel system had no leaks. Now came his least favorite part, wiring. He had to remove all the old unnecessary wires and rewire everything from scratch. When Jim pulled up the thick carpet in the car, he found the entire floor was covered in a layer of sound-deadening material. He normally dislikes this stuff, but it was stuck on so tightly that removing it would have been a massive job. In the end, he just left it. Most of the wiring work was handled by his friend, while he focused on installing a new serpentine belt and a new alternator in the engine bay. After that, he had to rebuild the ignition system. Fabricating custom ignition coil brackets is second nature to him by now. He also installed various sensors in the engine bay and some display screens inside the car. Then it was time to add fresh oil to the engine. Jim couldn't wait to start it up and see what else needed to be done. Tries, the engine fired up without any issues and ran very smoothly. At this point, the car's modification was mostly complete. The brake lines had been mostly removed earlier, so he replaced them all with new ones. Because of the massive raised intake manifold, the original hood was never going to fit. After a long search online, Jim finally found a suitable replacement. He test-fitted it and sat in the driver's seat. While it did obstruct his vision a bit, it wasn't a major issue. However, the edges of this used hood didn't line up perfectly, so it needed some modification. He tweaked the details and then found spots in the engine bay to mount the hood hinges and locking pins. But there was another problem. The car's exhaust now exited through the engine bay. This meant he had to cut 2 holes in the hood for the exhaust pipes to stick out. Unfortunately, he cut the holes a little too big. They looked like 2 giant nostrils. But at this point, he had to live with it. Jim filled the tank with fuel and started the engine again. Partly to test the engine bay temperatures and partly to check the transmission. The results were perfect and he was very satisfied. Finally, he reinstalled the car's interior, seats, and other trim pieces. And with that, the modification of this salvage auction Corvette C6 was complete. Jim immediately took the car to the dyno to see just how much horsepower it was making. The team was worried about something going wrong, so they took extra precautions to prevent this beast from getting loose. As the car started and let out a deafening roar, the first test run immediately hit 1,088 horsepower. They made a few small adjustments to the wastegates and ran it again. This time it exceeded 1,100 horsepower. Overall, Jim was more than happy with the result. Finally, he couldn't resist taking the car out for a spin, so let's see how it performs on the road.